at Cody University, New York, and the co-director of Human Rights and Gender Justice Clinic. It is my honor to welcome Lieutenant Commander Dr. Tyson Nicholas, UN military expert on investigation of sexual exploitation and abuse in conflict zones. I would also like to take this opportunity to welcome Dr. Emily Moraes. Dr. Moraes is the former director of San Francisco Department on the Status of Women. Very well written to you. I'm looking forward to learning a lot from you today. Without any further delay, I would now hand over the session to the chair of the evening, Professor Anju Saran, Professor of Department of Political Science and former Dean Faculty of Social Sciences at Banaras Hindu University. Over to you, ma'am. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Tanya. Thank you so very much. Once again, a very, I would say warm, but a very pleasant welcome to you all. It's already becoming very warm here in north of India. So, and wishing you all a very, very happy International Women's Day. We are really, really happy and grateful to Raisina House for making it possible for all of us to meet here, virtually though, and talk about something that is very, very important to the entire gender issue, and that is conflict and post-conflict reconstruction. And here by conflict, what I imply for this evening is not that conflict which is productive or positive, but conflict that probably is laden with violence. Our concern is not with people who are trying to upset the cart to make this world a nicer place, but our concern is to ensure that in that process, damage is not done to people who are other than the males here. So that the title here actually is very clear. It is a concern to go beyond masculinity. It's a learned audience here, so one doesn't have to kind of expatiate upon the title of this evening's presentation, except to say that yes, women and violence has been one of those very pressing issues that the world has been facing past more than 100 years. It's a pity that despite all the violence that happened in so many parts of the world, and I'm speaking especially about South Asia, where during the partition, there was tremendous violence that happened against women during the partition of India and Pakistan, and then after that, independence of Bangladesh, or again the secession of East Pakistan from West Pakistan. Down to very recent episodes of violence in both south of India, that is in Sri Lanka, and north of India, that is Nepal. There hasn't been so much concern with violence against women, which was damaging to them. We are all aware that 20 years ago, the United Nations brought about this resolution, which is known as Peace Resolution, or Resolution 1325 of the Security Council, and a lot of work has been done on that. And subsequent to that, there has been an extremely important asset, and that is that this has been foregrounded. So not only in the concerns which, not only the discussions in the high boardrooms, but also in small villages, this concern for involving women in peace processes, of standing up and taking note of the violence that happened against women or that happened against people of other than men, has been raised so very regularly and so very consciously. And there is a commitment across board to include women in various peace processes. So just to kind of set the ball rolling for this evening's event, I would like to invite Tyson Nicholas to speak about gender-based violence and about the peace concerns. You have probably a brief CV or introduction of Tyson Nicholas. He works for the UN Department of Peace Operations. He's a military expert on investigation of sexual exploitation and abuse of human rights, peace and security. And of course, it concerns R2P, WPS. For people who are not from academics, and I can see some of them, women, peace and security has been a regime that is concerns, that has occupied the attention of policymakers and practitioners, a responsibility to protect that has remained a concern of so many of us and have had diverse takes on that. That North and the West has had a different response to that, and people from the South, from where most of us are here today, have been suspicious about the, R2P. So Tyson Nicholas has been an expert on that, and he's witness to extreme attacks on human dignity and systematic and destructive use of sexual violence in conflict in the fragile settings. I'm very happy to also know that Tyson is an adjunct lecturer at Lund University in Sweden, a university with which Banaras Hindu University has had a long connection, and Sweden's been a place where some of us have also been trained in peace and conflict. This evening, Tyson will be talking about gender-based violence and peace. So we start with Tyson first, please. Welcome.
Thank you very much for that lovely introduction. And look, I just really wanted from the outset to say congratulations and happy Women's Day, International Women's Day to all the women out there. It's a great honour to be able to stand beside you all, and particularly on an event such as today. I'd also just like to point out from the very beginning that whilst today is a focal point for the discussion around women, and in particular, we're talking about violence against women, gender-based violence in conflict and fragile settings, today is only one of 365 days a year that this particular issue is certainly at the forefront of many of our minds. And so whilst we focus upon it today, I would encourage all who are dialing in to this to take away those little golden nuggets of information and ask themselves what they can do to also stand by those people who are perhaps being targeted by acts of sexual and gender-based violence in the context of conflict, fragility, and also relative peace. I'm so honoured just to stand by so many amazing women on this panel, and I feel very humbled to do so. My role here today will just be to briefly introduce some context and some issues around the use of sexual and gender-based violence in armed conflict and in states of fragility, in order to set the scene for my learned colleagues to then follow on behind me and then talk about issues to do with the new frontier of peace and security, and also issues from a local context. So with that in mind, I thought it's worthwhile to touch on UN Security Council Resolution 1325, and that's already been mentioned, and the associated resolutions that come after that frame the women, peace and security agenda. In particular, I would point all those who are in the audience to Security Council Resolution 1820. And the reason why I do that is because of the fundamental importance from global political perspective in how the Security Council acknowledges the use of sexual violence as a tactic in warfare to disproportionately target women and girls in the context of armed conflict. This is the first time, this is 2008 when this resolution comes forward. And whilst we would all acknowledge that sexual violence has been used from time immemorial, this is the first time the international community has taken a resolution or passed a resolution to deal with this issue. So in framing that, the importance of that, I would link to the overall women, peace and security agenda. But what I would also say as well is that it was about damn time. It's taken far too long for the international community to get to a point where they're willing to acknowledge it and they're willing to address it. The case of Jean-Paul Akiescu being charged through the International Criminal Tribunal in Rwanda is the first time where someone's convicted for war crimes and crimes against humanity for the use of sexual violence in a conflict. That's concerning to consider that, for example, at the International Military Tribunals in Nuremberg and in Tokyo, this particular issue was not dealt with, although it was well acknowledged and understood, at least privately, that sexual violence was prolific throughout that conflict. And indeed, as I mentioned, from time immemorial. So the first question we ask ourselves then is, where to from here? In the context of that, obviously, I can talk more strategically about the action for peacekeeping, the A4P agenda that the UN has. But look, I don't want to delve into those sort of areas of the politicking of things. I thought it might be useful for me to just lay out some of the things which we see across the 12 peacekeeping missions that we have, that the United Nations runs across the world. And certainly what we see is the prolific use of conflict-related sexual violence. We see sexual exploitation and sexual abuse as being an issue, and this is an issue in conflict, in fragility, in humanitarian action. But of course, in those contexts, like in every other context, we also see family violence, intimate partner violence, and other acts of gender-based violence perpetrated against people specifically because of their gender, and obviously other intersectional aspects of them as a person. The fundamental point, and I guess the key takeaway from anything I'm going to say today is probably this, and that is that any act of violence, but in particular acts of sexual and gender-based violence, are a direct threat to international peace and security, and obviously the dignity of an individual. So they're both, they straddle both the peace and security agendas, but also the human rights agendas from a UN perspective. And that is because such acts, as they threaten the individual's human's dignity, also have the ability, I should say, to both perpetuate violence, to cause violence, and to prolong violence. And if we are going to be able to achieve the ultimate goal of absolute gender equality, and we're talking now, UN Women says that we're probably another 100 years away from that, which frankly, in my mind, is not good enough. And clearly, I think everyone would agree with that. If we're going to be able to have any chance of achieving gender equality, then we have to be able to address issues to do with gender-based violence. We have to be able to address issues that impact on the respect for and the ability to protect and fulfill human rights. And with that, I guess that's my key takeaway, and I'd like to just finish those opening remarks there, and please pass the floor back to you. Thank you.
Thank you, Tyson. Very nice opening remarks. Yes, gender-based violence has been very rampant, and it's extremely difficult to visualize or to trace the history of gender-based violence. And sorry, and you've very rightly pointed out that there has to have a commitment not only of the international bodies, but also of individual countries to ensure that it is punished. And it's a rarity to punish somebody who has been indulging in gender-based violence. And that's that's a big question, how to ensure that countries go beyond their so-called self-respect image to not allow the international regime to take control of these violations. We move to Professor Lisa Davis, who has been very kind to come on board this evening. Professor Davis, as you know, is a co-director of Human Rights and Gender Justice Clinic. She's a specialist of international human rights and gender issues, women, LGBTQ and rights. And she has been, and they've been concerned with security issues, conflict, and disaster settings. They've testified in various international human rights bodies, if you please, the US Congress, UK Parliament, to name some of them. They've been board member of LGBTQ in Social Sciences and Public Policy Center at Roosevelt House, and will be talking to us this evening on new frontiers of women, peace and security regime. We know WPS is now, almost like an adult. If we, in the present scenario, if we label the 1325 as being born in the year 2000, October 2000, then it's almost going to be an adult of 21 years old this October. So there has to be a focus on, new frontiers of women, peace and security. So we are very happy and look forward to listening to Professor Davis's opening remarks on new frontiers of WPS. Professor Davis.
Well, thank you so much for that kind introduction. It's a pleasure to be here. I wanted to talk to everyone a little bit about, what is the next step? Just as you were saying, Andrea, what is the next step in terms of our work on the Women, Peace and Security docket? So we know that wartime abuses against women and LGBTIQ persons and other other person's, they're as old as human history, and they happen in every conflict. But outside of sexual violence, they're rarely held accountable. We rarely recognize what gender-based violence against women looks like outside of sexual violence, even though the language that we always use to capture these crimes is sexual and gender-based violence, or SGBV. So what are gender-based crimes? So more broadly, what we're talking about is we're talking about crimes that perpetrators commit in conflict or disaster to regulate gender narratives or gender expression. And this could be everything from sexual violence to controlling who people marry through forced marriage, reproductive choices, where they work, how they dress, and whether they're just simply allowed to exist. And when these gender narratives, these gender oppressions that armed actors impose when they roll into a community and take over, when they intertwine with other discriminatory narratives based on race or ethnicity, then we start to see double or even triple forms of discrimination and violence that are imposed on women by armed actors who hold these types of beliefs. So there's a charge under international criminal law that's designed to hold these types of crimes accountable. And that charge is called gender persecution. But never in the history of modern international criminal law, going back for 2 decades that it's been on the law books, never in history have we ever seen a single successful case of gender persecution ever charged in any criminal tribunal, including the International Criminal Court. Never, even though it's been on the law books. So why? How could this be the case if this is the tool that we have to hold perpetrators accountable for gender-based violence that is enacted against women, that includes sexual violence, but certainly goes beyond it? Well, I think part of the problem is we don't know what gender-based violence looks like outside of sexual violence in the context of conflict. We don't recognize it as documenters or investigators or even as victims or service providers. And because it goes invisible, we don't see it. So what do these crimes look like? What am I talking about? Well, if you look at ISIS, for example, in Iraq, there have been cases documented where women, doctors, who took their gloves off so that they could do medical duties and medical performances that they needed to do. They were tortured for taking their gloves off. There are cases of women that were tortured or beaten because, they may have lifted their niqab to drink water. And these cases of torture based on dress performance, how women were dressed or being out of compliance with how they were supposed to be dressed, they look just like cases in armed conflict everywhere in the world. They look like cases of armed conflict in Colombia, where there are documented cases of armed actors in Colombia's conflict that would torture or kill women who wore skirts that were deemed too short, or men who wore earrings, who were deemed to be gender nonconforming or LGBTIQ. They look like cases in Mali under Hassan, where under the AQIM regime, women were also tortured if they were out of dress compliance, if their hijab didn't look a certain way, or if they weren't wearing the right type of clothing. But clothing is just one example, and torture is just one example. There are also cases of murder, of other forms of violence, forced displacement, that are based on gender oppression of women. So, women killed because they had the wrong job, according to the perpetrator. For example, women who served as politicians have been killed because it's been deemed an inappropriate job for women by armed actors. So what happens in conflict? Well, we know what rape and torture and murder looks like. Forced forced displacement, forced disappearance. We know what these crimes look like. These are crimes under international criminal law. But if we don't get why these crimes were committed, if we don't get that a woman was tortured because she was a woman who took her gloves off, or because she wore a skirt that was deemed inappropriate, if we don't get that a woman was killed because she was a journalist or a human rights defender or a politician, if we don't get that why that crime happened, we're only getting half the story. And we're not getting all of these gendered crimes that happen to women in conflict that include sexual violence, but also go beyond it. And that is the next frontier of work that we need to do as an international community. We have the charge. It's gender-based persecution. It exists on the law books. It exists in the Rome Statute, which governs the International Criminal Court. Why has there never in decades been a successful charge? We have to ask ourselves that. It's because we don't see the why crimes are committed against women in conflict, and we need to grab that. And if we can capture that, and we can document those victims and those survivors of those crimes, then we can look at the Women, Peace, and Security docket. Let's look at those resolutions. For example, Resolution 2469 of the UN Security Council mandates that the UN Security, the international community take a survivor-centered approach to peace. Now, we know women are often excluded from peace processes, and usually that exclusion is because they're just less prioritized. And I'm talking about women civil society members, where studies have shown that women civil society members who participate in peace processes are more likely to lead to sustainable peace. I mean, it's evidence that's been documented by UN Women and other agencies. If you have women civil society members at the table, peace is more achievable. So why aren't they there? Well, there are stereotypes against women, and there are just less priority to have them there than to get the warring factions to the table. But if sustainable peace is our goal, then we have to have them at the table. Well, Resolution 2467 says you have to have a survivor-centered approach. You have to have survivors at the table in peace processes. And if we could recognize women as survivors of gender persecution, we could capture more crimes and hold more perpetrators accountable for crimes that are committed against women because they are women. And we would have a larger group of survivors that have a right to a seat at peace processes. And that would lead to more sustainable peace. And this, of course, applies to LGBTIQ persons as well, because they also suffer from the same type of gender discrimination as women from these types of crimes. So this is the new frontier, and this is what I ask all of you to think about in your work, ending sexual and gender-based violence in conflict settings. Look at crimes that fall outside of sexual violence. Don't forget the sexual violence, because that is also very real too. But look at all the other forms of discrimination behind violence that's committed against women. And let's get an accurate historical record of what's happening, and that will help lead us to a more sustainable peace. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Professor Davis. I'm so glad that you have, identified that gender-based violence is not limited only up to rape and murder and disappearances that the world has known so far. But there are so many new ways of, harassing people who do not fall under these categories that are binaries. There are direct and indirect harassments that are routine harassments for people who do not fall under these categories. And I'm so happy that you talk about the involvement of the civil society actors in redressing these challenges. And as a social scientist, my take on this whole thing is that it is because the way we are raising the generations that this whole, dystopia, this whole, myopia happens, that people are not aware about, to know that these alternative ways of violence are routinely being committed, and also they do not know why is it so, because there's so much a part of it. So there has to be a lot of, I think, soul searching on whether these things need to be introduced at school level or whether they need to be talked about openly. In my country, I recall some 30 years ago when that is her concern, Akanksha's concern.
Okay, sure. Well, all very interesting comments for sure. I think it's very, very challenging to, have any kind of global study that looks at increases or decreases of violence, especially and particularly gender-based violence, because of the copious amounts of stigma attached to gender-based violence and the lack of reporting. Sometimes we even see increases in gender-based violence because we see an increase in reporting, and that's good. We want to see an increase in reporting. So if even in places where you may see a decrease in violence, sometimes that comes even from stigma because there's been a decrease in reporting, especially if you look at how the political economic environment for that specific place may have changed. So I'm always a little leery, as you are, about statistics and what they may or may not tell us about what's happening in the world. But I can say that in terms of gender-based violence, the way that I have been describing it, meaning that it includes sexual violence, but specifically looking at all those other forms of violence based on discrimination, based on gender discrimination, that goes undocumented, that goes invisible, it goes unnoticed, that torture, that murder, that forced disappearance or forced displacement or forced marriage, that's based on gender, that type of violence isn't documented. It isn't documented. We don't have it. We don't have any accountability for it. So certainly we have no statistics about how that violence is enacted against women and LGBTIQ people around the world. And that's, what my call has been, is that we need to start looking at that violence, coming up with a language for it and understanding it, because it is illegal under law, because it's a form of gender persecution. So we know what racial persecution is. We know what ethnic persecution is, right? It's when, an armed actor or another perpetrator commits egregious crimes against another ethnicity or race because of their ethnicity or because of their race. We have documented cases. We've held these types of crimes accountable in the world before, but we never have for gender, when it's based on gender, when it's discrimination because she is a woman or because that person is an LGBTIQ, gender nonconforming or non-binary person. So we don't have a language for it. It's invisible. There's just not enough evidence to really know. There is evidence, but there's not enough discovery of that evidence to even be able to talk about whether it's up or down, because it's invisible. I would say too, I think one thing that's very critical that we need to remember is that there's a difference in gender-based violence legally than other forms of violence, and that's gender discrimination. So while, for example, cisgendered heteronormative men may also experience sexual violence as gendered crimes, the nuance is critical. And while the stigma for all sexual violence crimes that anyone who is subjected to is deeply impactful and certainly a barrier we need to get through, and all forms of sexual violence is egregious and needs to be addressed, that legal element of discrimination, of why that crime happens and how it happens and how it's played out, we need to recognize that form of discrimination. And that's what really separates out all forms of sexual violence from sexual violence that's committed against women and LGBTIQ persons. So once you recognize that discrimination in the violence against women and LGBTIQ persons and gender nonconforming persons and non-binary persons, then you can start remedying it under law. Then you can start changing and amending laws to make sure we're capturing the nuance and we're rooting out discrimination, at its foundation, at its core, because that's part of what perpetuates that type of violence, And that's the only way to get rid of it. And that's why that discrimination is so important to recognize. And that's why it's really important to recognize the linkage between women and LGBTIQ people, because, you know, that's what they share in common in terms of when they are victims of gender-based violence. What they share in common is the discrimination that is motivating the violence that's happening to them. I hope that, you know, answers or responds appropriately to the comments.
Yeah, I'm sure, yes, that's what the response, that's how it can be explained. There are a bunch of questions that maybe all the panelists can respond to. And there is a concern about the people who are displaced, whether they are internally displaced or they are in refugee camps, and how the sexual violence, Gaurav Shah asks, how the sexual violence in refugee camps doesn't hit the media, and how to address this issue. Like, you know, denial of the existence of sexual violence in refugee camps. Simran is concerned about displacement, and women and girls suffer disproportionately from displacement, and there are pre-existing discriminations and socioeconomic disadvantages, and how that discrimination, which is, Simran is not talking about violence, but then, you know, she's essentially talking about silencing the voices of those who've been displaced. And there are a couple of questions on violence and caste violence in India, which I'm sure somebody other than the three other panelists will be in a position to respond. So maybe Professor Davies can respond to that briefly, and the other panelists would like to butt in on these issues of violence against women in refugee camps or in displaced, you know, regions where their own communities are not there to protect them as their first port of call against protecting gender violence is at times, it's not always the community, but at times it is the communities that come to support them. So your responses, Professor Davis, and then maybe Dr. Murase and Tyson Nichols would be you know, able to add in. Yeah, Professor Davis.
Well, let me just say I'm really glad that this point was brought up, because it is so true that sexual and gender-based violence in refugee camps can be pervasive, or displacement camps. And, you know, part of the problem is that the impunity that surrounds sexual and gender-based violence, whether it's conflict in the Congo or it's from a hurricane in the United States, everywhere in the world where we see conflict or disaster, we see a rise in sexual or gender-based violence. And we see this rise because of the impunity and the chaos that disaster and conflict create. So it happens everywhere in the world, and it happens anywhere people are displaced, from the US to the Congo. And it's an issue that we as an international community, I think, still struggle with how to address it, and how to reach those victims and survivors, and how to create a space for them to be able to come forward, because it hides in the shadows. So I think just briefly what I can say is that there are some very interesting programs that are happening out there. You know, one of the problems in displacement and refugee camps is, how do you reach survivors when there's no internet access, right? We all use cell phones very commonly in the world. We use cell phones for internet and to get our news and media. And one thing that we see that happens in refugee and displacement camps is that folks will share information with each other through Bluetooth. So they'll send messages, and anybody within 40 feet can get it. We can see that messaging can go very, very fast through an entire camp through Bluetooth messaging. So what some groups have been doing is putting out that messaging around domestic violence or sexual violence, and saying, if you need help, come to the tent on the corner, or call, text this number, or put something outside of your tent or your place, like a red blanket to signal that you want somebody to come and check on you. And these ways that we can communicate and get those messages through a camp can really have a profound impact in being able to reach victims, because that's the first step, is being able to recognize it's an issue, and then knowing you have to reach victims, and knowing that this is a phenomenon that happens all over the world in every country, and that we need to do better to look at it as a universal problem of whenever there's impunity, and work together to really resolve it. So thank you.
Thank you. Dr. Murase, would you like to share some of your practices in terms of protecting people who are in either in refugee camps or displaced people? And what is happening at the local level? Is there something you would like to add here?
Sure, yes. I did want to amplify Professor Davis's message about invisibility, right? So long as a problem is invisible, there is no solution. And so the issue that was raised about displaced persons, marginalized persons, is really all about making visible what's invisible, whether it's human trafficking or sexual violence. And there's a question in the chat about the media not covering these stories. If you have a cell phone, you are part of media, right? So whether it's Facebook or WhatsApp or Instagram, you are part of the media. And I want to urge the audience to consider themselves as a member of the media, write a story about marginalized groups, be the voice for people who are not voiceless. That is one strategy that you can use. And there was also a question in the chat about the influence of women and public participation. So the Japanese American community in the United States during World War II were incarcerated by the government for no good reason other than the color of our skin. And as a result of that, there's been this kind of allergic reaction to public participation. There are very, very few Japanese Americans in politics. So I had to really overcome a lot of cultural disincentives to run for office. So I do want to encourage people in the audience to think about how they can participate publicly. In San Francisco, we have 80 different commissions on parks, on the environment, and that's public business. Think about running for a city council, raising your voice on behalf of people who are voiceless, challenging. There was a question in the chat about how do we challenge the system, is by participating publicly. And in fact, that's the theme for this year's UN Commission on the Status of Women meetings.
Yes.
Women and public participation.
Thank you, Dr. Murase. Tyson, would you like to, share your exposures with what you witnessed in these camps as somebody who's had a first-hand information and how to go about it?
Yes, certainly. Look, I guess I'll frame the comments that I'll make around the experience that I've had in seeing and working in IDP camps in South Sudan, in camps of as large as 30,000 people, and also camps in the northern parts of Iraq and Syria with up to 70,000 people in some of those camps, both internally displaced persons and in some cases refugees as well. I guess the key point that to draw out from this is that this all comes from the point already raised, and that's about the level of impunity that exists around the use of sexual and gender-based violence, and particularly in the context of being able to displace people. And so, we're talking about people in camps, but even drawing that back further and looking at the root cause for why those people are in the camps in the first place, we often see in non-international armed conflict and in more modern asymmetric warfare scenarios, situations where people are deliberately displaced and sexual violence is the tool that's used to force that displacement. Either the threat of it or the actual use of it against people based upon a vulnerability and a power imbalance between those armed actors, whether they be state actors or non-state actors, and those peoples in those communities. And so that's a significant issue in terms of impunity, and it's a significant challenge for both national governments and the international community to deal with. I think that In terms of the sexual violence perpetrated, and I speak about sexual violence because that's my expertise, and in some ways I'll stay inside my lane, but the level of sexual violence utilised or perpetrated in camps can be significant. And I would frame it around the discussion around not just sexual abuse, which is obviously, as we know, inherently unlawful, violating both international law and national laws, but also issues to do with survival sex and transactional sex as well. And obviously that links into my work in the United Nations with sexual exploitation and abuse. And so transactional sex is obviously when people engage in sex work or work in that scenario, but it doesn't necessarily mean that there's always absolute informed consent to be able to do that. Clearly, obviously, human trafficking links into this. Clearly, issues to do with having no other options from an economic perspective to do this, and that links into survival sex. And survival sex obviously occurs where people do this as a means of survival, as a means of having access to resources, and that's a significant challenge it's a significant challenge in San Francisco, as is well pointed out. It's also it's an inherently significant challenge in areas where there is such fragility that there is no law and order, or there's very little of it, where there's a lack of resources. There is these great power imbalances, and there is victimization of people based upon a whole bunch of intersectional reasons. And in that respect, there clearly all of these things disproportionately impact women and girls. I would also point out as well that in many respects, what sometimes happens here is that the perpetrators of these acts of violence, whether they be the sexual abuse or sexual exploitation acts, often fall between the cracks between what is national law and what is international law, and that level of impunity is further exacerbated, particularly in, say, for example, in cases where the UN itself, where the UN would run an IDP camp. In that context, there, obviously, people within the IDP camp who are themselves committing crimes, it presents a significant challenge for international organisations and international community. And I say that because in most cases, when people are in IDP camps, they're doing so because they require protection, and they require protection from another armed force or another armed group or another ethnic group that is looking to target them and to kill them, as well as to perpetrate other acts of violence against them. But then, obviously, then if they're in that camp, being provided that protection within the IDP camp, and then they then turn around themselves and perpetrate acts of violence against other people within the camps. Usually those camps, they try to be segregated out based upon a number of indicators of where those people have come from, what communities they are from, what particular tribe, ethnicity, or race they may be, to take account for the situation. Clearly, two warring tribes, you don't want to put them together in a camp. But in that respect, there, when they turn around and themselves perpetrate violence, then that is significantly challenging because there often is no legal mechanism in which to deal with these people in the immediate. And I say that because often you would say that the national government has the responsibility to deal with that from a legal perspective. And in many cases, if these people are seeking protection from that national government, that is a challenge. You can't hand that person over, even though they might be accused of a grave crime. And by the same token there, then if you are, for example, an international organisation like the UN, stand fast having that person go before the ICC, there is not much of a court system in place from an international perspective to be able to deal with them. And so those types of people fall between the cracks, and that's a significant concern and a significant challenge. And it's something that from a detention management perspective, when you are looking at running IDP camps or refugee camps, it's something that is challenging for all organisations that do that, whether they be UN organisations or whether they be other NGOs or major international organisations, and that in itself presents further challenges. That's some observations I would make. I don't really have any solutions for that at this stage. What I'm proposing for you here is some of the challenges we face for consideration of the audience, vice proposing perhaps what my solution may be.
Thank you so very much, We do have some more questions, but essentially the concern is, I think, of course, about the discriminatory practices that countries have, especially when it comes to International Criminal Court and the International Criminal Regime, and the nature of impunity, which is so very rampant, and that has been a concern of all of us here this evening. And also about, my basic concern has been with, when you look at the pictures, when you meet these displaced people, so many times, it is not very helpful to simply have a message conveyed, because that message gets to be very difficult to be conveyed for lack of language, for even lack of the capacity to use a smartphone, for instance, or to use a tablet, even though you might, the CSOs might distribute some of them to those who are affected, it so very often doesn't get to where to where we want them to reach. So there are challenges that are so very common, that are so very rampant, but those challenges don't mean that we should stop talking about them, or we should stop taking note of them. As academics, people who are like Professor Davis or like Dr. Murase or me or Tyson, we are there to analyze things. And a part of us also at times try to be, active, or I wouldn't know about how would you describe yourselves, but at times I feel that one has to step out of this, the gown and go to the town and actually be interventionist. But there are severe limitations in diverse regimes that people are able to do that kind of work and people are not able to do that kind of work. One also has to battle with so many false propaganda that goes around in almost all the cultures against those who are affected adversely by wars, domestic wars, spilling across state borders, compelling people to leave their homes and seek refuge in other states. They might be very welcoming, they might not be, that very welcoming. And in the absence of a very enforceable international regime, it becomes a tough job to ensure their safety and to ensure that their human dignity is respected. There are concerns about caste violence, which are, yes, at places we still witness them. Since I'm the only one from India here who can respond to the question about caste violence. But I have to say that that is increasingly on the decrease. More and more people are talking about it, not only in the journals of international relations or political science, but also in literature, in art forms, in performative, in performance, in theater, for instance. And there is a growing consciousness to raise the voice against caste violence. And it's not only in the states that we talk about Black Lives Matter that gets a reflection all across the world. And this is not simply relevant to the country where I'm speaking from. It is relevant to, I would think, most parts of the world. I was in Sweden for a couple of years, and the area of my inquiry was the role of immigrant women in politics. And to my utter surprise, I would so many times come across this concern that, yes, the way you speak is different, the way perhaps at times you look is also different. So your general acceptability amongst those whom you want to go out and vote for you gets diminished automatically. So I think there has to be a level which has to be very, generate confidence amongst people to ensure that people know what is happening around, and they also know what is right and what is wrong. And when any wrong is happening, to raise their voices even at the cost of being declared as outcasts in certain societies. So that is something that each one of us, especially the young people who are present here, need to be very particular about. I've lived in post-conflict Nepal for 2 long years, worked with former combatants, and to my utter dismay, have found that even the DDR process that was very much in place, and India was a guarantor of the peace accord of Nepal, the process, although tried to ensure to bring in women and people from other traditions, was just not there. And the women leaders who were also part of what they called the People's Liberation Army, that is during for lack of any other word, not the civil war, but the uncivil war that was happening within their jurisdiction, the domestic war, they would feel very confident saying that, okay, so what if we were not invited on the peace table, but our partners were there and they knew what we wanted. So much about involving women in the peace process, that such empowered women who would even be commanders of their units in the war which was happening from the people, they would feel absolutely at ease that they are being represented. These women politicians who would form 1/3 of the interim government, they would constantly keep looking back on their shoulders, waiting for directives from the male colleagues to come up and to then sign on the dotted line. So there are layers within layers, and the reality is not very easily solvable, not very easily understandable to begin, and then still more difficult to achieve. And so these are things that I'm sure we'll continue to keep talking about. And I think we've covered most of the questions. It's not solvable or unsolvable in an hour and 15 minute session. I'm happy that at least a discourse like this happened this evening. And here in India, this afternoon when we were celebrating the International Women's Day, I was recalling that when we were growing up in the 70s and the 60s, there was no mention of the International Women's Day. So at least now there is a consciousness that there is this issue which concerns women. And people are questioning the accepted norms. People are talking about how to challenge what is supposed to be the prevalent narrative about this is what is right and this is what has to be accepted. So I think with these words, time is almost up, and I need to simply express my gratitude to Professor Lisa Davis, to Dr. Emily Murase, and to Tyson Nicholas for being present here this evening, though virtually. Maybe someday soon, we will be in a position to invite you people physically over. Some of our young people might be traveling to your country and would seek and might like to connect with you on issues that are extremely, extremely important. The participation of our young people has been simply very, very impressive. And I'm so very happy that Raisina House has given us all this opportunity to celebrate this International Women's Day in such a meaningful fashion. So with my gratitude to Raisina House, I hand over to the organizers, who probably will have a formal vote of thanks to all the panelists here. Thank you.
I would like to take this moment to thank Mr. Tyson Nicholas, Professor Lisa Davis, Dr. Emily Murase, and Professor Anju Saran, and all the audience for joining us in this session. We're immensely grateful to our speakers and the session chair for taking out time from their schedules and engaging with us on this very particular topic. Their willingness to share their time and expertise in the area, which was very critical to the success of this event, and I'm sure we will walk back with a more clear picture on this topic. We hope to have all of you in all our future sessions, and a very pleasant evening to one and all present here.
Thank you. Thank you, and hope to see you soon sometime, someday.